They mocked Amara Johnson's stutter in the hallways of Westlake Middle School, Jake Williams with his cruel imitations, Mrs. Kent with her thinly veiled contempt. When the dreaded oral presentation assignment was announced, Amara's stomach knotted with familiar dread. But that evening, in her grandmother Eleanor's attic, she discovered a box of classified documents and a photograph of Eleanor in military uniform. "We were codebreakers," her grandmother whispered, eyes distant with memories. Black women who helped win the war, then came home to silence. No textbook mentioned them. No history class honored them. As Amara pieced together her grandmother's secret past at Bletchley Park, she found something unexpected forming within herself. Courage. Eleanor had broken enemy codes under bombs. Perhaps Amara could break through her own barriers, word by stuttered word, until a school, a community, and eventually a nation would be forced to listen to voices history had tried to erase. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The sun filtered through the thin curtains of Amara Johnson's bedroom, casting a soft golden glow across her determined face. Standing before the mirror, she took a deep breath and gripped the edges of her handwritten note cards. "My name is A.A. Amara Johnson," she began, frowning at her reflection. She closed her eyes, using the technique she'd practiced countless times. Breathe in for 4, hold for 2, exhale for 6. "My name is Amara Johnson." Better. Still not perfect, but better. At 12 years old, Amara had been battling her stutter for as long as she could remember. Most days, she managed to hide it by speaking as little as possible. But the upcoming presentation in Mrs. Kent's English class had her stomach tied in knots. "You're up early, sunshine," came a warm voice from her doorway. Amara's grandmother, Eleanor Johnson, stood watching her with knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than the ocean. Though in her 80s, Eleanor carried herself with the posture of someone who had never been allowed to slouch, even for a moment. "Just practicing, Grandma," Amara said, quickly tucking her note cards into her pocket. Eleanor crossed the room, with measured steps, and placed her hands on Amara's shoulders. "Words are just codes, Amara. And every code can be broken with the right key." Amara looked up at her grandmother's face, weathered by time but still radiating quiet strength. "I don't think it's that simple. Nothing worth doing ever is," Eleanor replied, smoothing Amara's carefully braided hair. "But remember this, they can only silence you if you let them." Before Amara could ask what she meant, her mother called from downstairs. "Amara, buses. Coming in 10 minutes. The yellow school bus lumbered down Maple Street like a reluctant beast. Amara climbed aboard, keeping her eyes fixed on the gray rubber floor as she made her way down the aisle. The bus was already half full with students from her middle school, their conversations forming a chaotic symphony of preteen drama and laughter. She slid into an empty seat near the back, immediately pulling out her history textbook as a shield. 3 stops later, Jake Williams boarded with his usual swagger. Tall for 13, with sandy blonde hair and a smile that teachers seemed to find charming, Jake was the unofficial king of the 7th grade. His father was on the school board, his mother headed the PTA, and Jake himself had never faced a consequence he couldn't charm his way out of. "Hey guys," Jake announced loudly, settling into the seat across from Amara. "You know what I did this weekend?" Laughter erupted around him as he launched into a mocking impression of Amara's stutter. She kept her eyes fixed on her book, pretending not to hear, though each exaggerated stammer felt like a needle piercing her skin. "Dude, that's so her!" A girl named Brooke giggled, glancing over her shoulder at Amara. "I bet she can't even say her own name," Jake continued, encouraged by his audience. Amara turned to look out the window, watching the familiar streets of their small town blur past. She'd learned long ago that reacting only made it worse, so she disappeared into herself, as she'd become expert at doing. By the time the bus reached Westlake Middle School, Amara had mentally rehearsed her entrance to Mrs. Kent's English class 20 times. Head down, quick walk to her seat in the back corner, no eye contact. The less attention she drew, the better. Mrs. Kent's classroom was arranged in neat rows, with motivational posters covering nearly every inch of wall space. "Speak up," declared one in bold letters. "Your voice matters," insisted another. Amara found them cruelly ironic. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Kent greeted the class with her practiced smile. In her mid-40s with immaculately styled blonde hair and designer clothes, Mrs. Kent was considered one of the school's best teachers. Parents requested her class. Students competed for her attention. Awards lined her desk like trophies. "Before we begin, I'd like to collect yesterday's homework," she announced, striding between the rows with effortless confidence. When she reached Amara's desk, the girl held up her neatly completed assignment. "I finished the—" "Yes, thank you, Amara," Mrs. Kent cut in smoothly, taking the paper before Amara could finish her sentence. She moved on quickly, leaving Amara with her words hanging unfinished in the air. This was how it always went. Mrs. Kent never openly mocked Amara's stutter like Jake and the others did. Instead, she employed a subtler approach, finishing Amara's sentences, calling on her less frequently, suggesting written alternatives to oral participation, all done with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Now, class, I have an exciting announcement," Mrs. Kent said, returning to the front of the room. "Our next major project will be an oral presentation on unsung heroes of World War II. A collective groan rippled through the classroom. Now, Mrs. Kent chided gently. "This is your opportunity to dig deeper than your textbooks. I want you to find the stories that history forgot, the brave men and women whose contributions changed the course of the war, but who may not have received proper recognition." Amara's stomach clenched. Oral presentation. The two most terrifying words in school vocabulary. "Each of you will have exactly 5 minutes to present your hero to the class," Mrs. Kent continued. "You'll need visuals, primary sources if possible, and a compelling narrative. This will count for 30% of your final grade." As Mrs. Kent handed out the project guidelines, Amara's mind raced. Maybe she could get out of it somehow. Maybe her mother would write a note. Maybe... "And Amara," Mrs. Kent's voice broke through her panic, "perhaps you'd prefer to submit a written report instead, given your difficulties with public speaking." The classroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward Amara, whose cheeks burned with humiliation. I can do the presentation," she managed to say, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Mrs. Kent's smile tightened slightly. "Well, if you change your mind, just let me know." The bell couldn't ring soon enough. When it finally did, Amara gathered her things quickly, avoiding the snickers and sideways glances from her classmates. She made her way to the cafeteria and found an empty table in the corner where she could eat her lunch in peace, or so she thought. "Did you see her face when Mrs. Kent called her out?" Brooke's voice carried across the lunchroom. She sat with Jake and their friends just 2 tables away, not bothering to lower her voice. Like, how is she even going to give a presentation when she can't even talk? "Maybe she'll just stand there and stutter for 5 minutes, Jake laughed. "That would be hilarious." Amara pushed her sandwich away, her appetite gone. She pulled out her notebook instead and began brainstorming topics for her presentation. Famous generals? Too obvious. The Navajo code talkers? Everyone would choose them. She needed something unique, something that would make even Jake and Brooke shut up and listen. That evening, Amara found her grandmother in the living room, an old photo album open on her lap. Eleanor rarely spoke about her past, and the family albums were usually kept in the attic, gathering dust. "What are you looking at, Grandma?" Amara asked, settling beside her on the worn sofa. Eleanor's fingers, thin but steady, traced the outline of a black and white photograph. In it, a much younger Eleanor stood with a group of women, all in neat uniforms, outside a grand stone building that looked like it belonged in England. "Just remembering," Eleanor said softly. "Is that from when you lived in England?" Amara asked. She knew her grandmother had spent time overseas during the war, but details were scarce. Eleanor nodded slowly. "It was another life, sweetheart. Another world." "Would you tell me about it?" Amara asked, I need to do a report on unsung heroes of World War II for school. Eleanor's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something between pride and pain crossing her weathered features. There are some stories that weren't meant to be told, Amara. Not back then, anyway. Why not? Because, Eleanor said, closing the album carefully. We weren't allowed to talk about it. We signed papers, took oaths. The work we did, it was secret. Amara's curiosity sparked. What kind of work? Eleanor stood up, placing the album on the shelf. Maybe someday you'll understand, but not tonight. It's getting late. But Amara couldn't let it go. The next morning she caught her grandmother, alone in the kitchen before school. Grandma, I want to do my presentation on you, she said firmly, with barely a stutter. Whatever you did during the war, that's my topic. Eleanor looked up from her tea, surprised. Amara, I wasn't a hero. I was just a young woman doing her job. But you were there, Amara insisted. You were part of history, and... She hesitated. And you're my grandma. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. What would your teachers say about that? Amara bit her lip, remembering Mrs. Kent's dismissive attitude. I don't know, but it's my project, and I get to choose. Later that day, when Amara shared her topic choice with Mrs. Kent, the teacher's response was exactly as she'd feared. Your grandmother? Mrs. Kent's perfectly arched eyebrows rose in skepticism. Let's keep it academic, Amara. Real history. I'm looking for documented heroes, not family stories. From the front row, Jake turned to smirk at Amara. What did her grandma do? Bake cookies for the soldiers? He whispered loudly to Brooke, who covered her mouth to stifle a giggle. My grandmother worked in England during the war, Amara said, forcing the words out as steadily as she could. She was involved in important work. I'm sure she was, Mrs. Kent replied, in a tone that suggested the opposite. But for this assignment, I'd prefer you choose someone with verifiable historical significance. Amara felt heat rising to her face, not from embarrassment this time, but from anger. She is significant. The class fell silent, shocked by Amara's defiance. Mrs. Kent's smile faltered for a split second before returning, brittle as thin ice. Well, it's your grade, she said dismissively. Moving on. That night, Amara sat cross-legged on her grandmother's bedroom floor, a tape recorder between them. It had taken hours of gentle persuasion, but Eleanor had finally agreed to share at least part of her story. They called us ghosts, Amara, Eleanor began, her voice taking on a distant quality. Because we were there, doing vital work, but invisible, to history. We saved lives without firing a gun. What kind of work did you do? Amara asked, leaning forward. Eleanor closed her eyes, as if seeing it all again behind her eyelids. I was a codebreaker, one of several black women recruited for a special unit. We were sent to Bletchley Park in England, though at the time, no one knew what really happened there. You broke Nazi codes? Amara's eyes widened in disbelief. We did, Eleanor nodded. Day and night we worked on intercepted German messages. Numbers, letters, patterns. The men who ran the place didn't think we'd be smart enough at first. Being both black and women, well, they underestimated us twice. Over. Amara pressed record on the small device, determined to capture every word. This was history. Her history. And Mrs. Kent would have to acknowledge it. The next evening, Amara sat at her desk surrounded by pages of notes from her interview with Eleanor. The more her grandmother had spoken, the more animated she'd become, as if reliving a time when she'd been vital, necessary, alive in ways that transcended the limitations placed upon her. We weren't supposed to be there at all, Eleanor had explained. Black women weren't being recruited for much of anything in those days, let alone secret intelligence work. But there was this officer, Captain Harrington, who'd seen some of us working as telephone operators at Fort Meade. He noticed how fast we could route calls, how we'd developed our own shorthand system. He wondered if we might be good with codes. Amara had written it all down, sketching maps of England based on Eleanor's descriptions, carefully noting the names of the other women in her unit. Ruth, Pearlie, Daisy, Wilma, and May, women who'd been brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers in a time when they weren't even allowed to eat in the same restaurants as white people back home. Now, she was transforming these stories into a presentation board. In the center, she'd placed the photograph of her grandmother's unit outside Bletchley Park. Around it, she arranged her notes in chronological order, creating a timeline of Eleanor's service. "You need to understand, Amara," Eleanor had said. "What we did saved lives, real lives. When we decoded German transmissions about U-boat locations, Allied ships could change course. When we figured out their attack plans, our troops could prepare. But nobody knew it was us. Nobody was allowed to know." As Amara worked, she felt a strange connection forming, not just to her grandmother, but to history itself. These women had changed the course of the war from behind the scenes, their contributions buried under layers of secrecy and prejudice. And now, decades later, Amara would give them a voice. The following day, Amara brought some of her preliminary research to show Mrs. Kent after class. She'd hoped the teacher might change her mind once she saw the evidence, the photograph, the names, the dates that aligned perfectly with documented events of the war. "Mrs. Kent, I wanted to show you what I've found about my grandmother's service," Amara said, approaching the teacher's desk after the other students had filed out. Mrs. Kent barely glanced at the materials. "Amara, I'm concerned that you're pursuing this topic despite my recommendation. Oral history is notoriously unreliable, especially when it comes to family stories. People tend to embellish." "But I have proof," Amara insisted, pushing the photograph forward. "This is my grandmother at Bletchley Park. These women were codebreakers." Mrs. Kent picked up the photo with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her. "This is just a picture of some women in uniform. It proves nothing about what they actually..." She set it down dismissively. "Amara, I'm trying to help you. If you want to get a good grade, you need to choose a topic with legitimate historical sources." "This is legitimate," Amara said, her voice rising slightly. Her stutter receded as indignation took its place. "Just because it's not in our textbook doesn't mean it didn't happen." The classroom fell silent. Through the open door, a few lingering. Students turned to watch, including Jake, who had stopped to tie his shoe. Mrs. Kent's smile vanished entirely. "I think you're exaggerating for attention, Amara, and I don't appreciate being contradicted in my own classroom." From the doorway, Jake snickered. "Ooh, busted." Mrs. Kent glanced up. "That's enough, Jake. Go to your next class." But the damage was done. Amara gathered her materials with trembling hands, shame and anger warring inside her. As she headed for the door, she heard whispers from the hallway. Word would spread. By lunch, everyone would know that weird, stuttering Amara Johnson had been shut down by Mrs. Kent. Yet something had shifted inside her. For the first time, Amara felt certain that she was right and an authority figure was wrong. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. At lunch, Amara sat alone as usual, pushing her food around her tray without eating. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice someone approaching until a lunch tray clattered onto the table across from her. "Is this seat taken?" asked a quiet voice. Amara looked up to find Emily Taylor standing there. With her straight brown hair and oversized glasses, Emily wasn't part of Jake's popular crowd, but she wasn't an outcast either. She existed in that middle ground of middle school, neither bullied nor bullying, just moving through the days unnoticed. No, Amara replied, surprised. Emily sat down and opened her milk carton. "I heard what you said to Mrs. Kent, about your grandmother being a codebreaker." Amara tensed, waiting for the mockery. "And?" "I think it's cool," Emily said simply. "My grandpa was in the war too. He was on a destroyer in the Pacific. He doesn't talk about it much, but he has all these medals he keeps in a cigar box." Amara blinked, unsure how to respond to this unexpected alliance. "Mrs. Kent thinks I'm making it up." Emily shrugged. "Adults think they know everything, but they don't." A tiny smile tugged at Amara's lips. "No, they don't." "Want to work on it together? The presentation?" Emily asked, as if suggesting something completely ordinary. "My grandpa might have some books that could help. He's really into war history." For a moment, Amara couldn't speak. and not because of her stutter. She'd grown so accustomed to isolation that friendship felt like a foreign language. "I'd like that," she finally managed. That afternoon, Emily walked home with Amara, chattering about her grandfather's war stories and how he still wrote letters to his old Navy buddies. As they turned onto Amara's street, Emily pointed to a man watching them from a porch 2 houses down. "That's Mr. Peterson. He served in Vietnam, I think. Mom says he keeps to himself because of something called PTSD. Amara nodded. She'd seen Mr. Peterson before, with his stoic expression and military straight posture. He reminded her a little of Eleanor. When they reached Amara's house, Eleanor was waiting on the front steps, a large metal box beside her. Age had bent her back, but not her spirit. She still held herself with dignity that bordered on defiance. "Grandma, this is Emily," Amara said. "She's helping me with my presentation." Eleanor studied Emily with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Nice to meet you, young lady. Any friend of Amara's is welcome here." "It's nice to meet you too, Mrs. Johnson," Emily replied. "Amara told me you were a codebreaker during World War II. That's really amazing." A shadow of something, pride, regret, crossed Eleanor's face. "It was a long time ago." "But important," Amara insisted. "And that's why I want to tell your story." Eleanor gestured to the box beside her. "Then maybe this will help." She ran her hand over its dented lid. "This box cost me my voice, Amara. Now it may help you find yours." The girls exchanged curious glances as Eleanor unlocked the box with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside lay a treasure trove of history, photographs yellowed with age, military papers stamped "Top Secret" in faded red ink, a group portrait of black women in uniform with names carefully written on the back, letters from officers praising their work without specifics, and, most startling of all, a handwritten note of commendation signed by Eleanor Roosevelt herself. "The First Lady knew about you?" Emily gasped, carefully lifting the fragile paper. Eleanor nodded. "She visited Bletchley once, insisted on meeting all the women working there, including us. The men in charge weren't happy about it, but who's going to say no to the president's wife?" Amara picked up one of the photos, her grandmother standing next to a complex machine with dials and rotors. "What's this?" "That's an Enigma machine," Eleanor explained. "The Germans used it to encode their messages. Our job was to figure out the settings they were using each day, so we could decode their transmissions." Emily studied the machine with fascination. "How did it work?" "It substituted letters. Pressing A might produce G, for example. But the settings changed daily, and there were millions of possible combinations. Finding the right one was like—" Eleanor paused, searching for words a 12-year-old would understand. "It was like trying to guess someone's password, but the password was 20 characters long and changed every single day." Amara carefully gathered the most important documents. "Can I make copies of these for my presentation?" "That's why I brought them out," Eleanor said. "It's time people knew the truth." The next day, Amara brought copies of Eleanor's documents to school, confident that even Mrs. Kent couldn't dismiss such concrete evidence. But the teacher's reaction exceeded her worst fears. "These could be anything, Amara," Mrs. Kent said, barely glancing at the papers. "Anyone can create official-looking documents these days. Without legitimate sources, books, historical journals, recognized archives, I cannot allow you to present this material as fact." "But they are real," Amara protested, her stutter momentarily forgotten in her indignation. "I'm sorry, but I need legitimate sources," Mrs. Kent repeated firmly. "Unless you can provide verification from a recognized historical authority, you'll need to choose another topic. Perhaps something from our textbook." The classroom had gone. Silent, everyone watching the confrontation with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Jake, predictably, was enjoying the show, while Emily looked on with sympathy from her seat. "But," Amara began. "I've made my decision," Mrs. Kent cut her off. "Class, please open your textbooks to page 127. Defeated, Amara slumped in her seat. She'd been so sure the documents would convince Mrs. Kent, so certain that truth would win out. Now, She felt foolish for believing that evidence mattered when prejudice had already made up its mind. After class, she fled to the girls' bathroom, locking herself in a stall as tears finally broke free. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal door, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Why won't they believe me?" she asked Eleanor that night, curled up on her grandmother's bed like she used to do as a little girl. Eleanor stroked Amara's hair gently. "Because you come from a line of women they were taught not to see." "That's not fair," Amara whispered. "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's not. But fairness has never been part of the equation, child. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Amara looked up at her grandmother, seeing not the elderly woman with arthritis and reading glasses, but the young codebreaker who had helped win a war in secret. "I'm going to make them see." Eleanor smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her face. "That's my girl." Eleanor Johnson's living room was transformed into a training ground. The coffee table had been pushed aside, replaced by a makeshift podium, a stack of old encyclopedias atop a TV tray. Amara stood before it, shoulders squared as her grandmother circled her with the critical eye of a drill sergeant. "Again," Eleanor commanded, her voice firm but kind. From the beginning. Amara took a deep breath, applying the technique Eleanor had taught her. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale for 6. "My grandmother Eleanor Johnson was stationed at B. Bletchley Park in 1943. "Good," Eleanor nodded. "Now remember what I told you about pacing. When you feel a stutter coming, don't fight it. Slow down. Give the word space to form." "Bletchley Park," Amara repeated, stretching out each syllable. "Bletchley Park." "Better," Eleanor smiled. "During the war, we had to memorize pages of code sequences. If we hesitated or stumbled, it could cost lives. So we developed methods to control our speech, our breathing, our focus." For the past week, grandmother and granddaughter had established this evening ritual, an hour of speech exercises before dinner, followed by research and preparation for the presentation. Though Amara's stutter didn't vanish, it became more manageable, less intrusive. "Stand up straight," Eleanor would remind her. "When you slouch, you compress your diaphragm. Your words need room to breathe." Or, "Speak to the back wall, not to your shoes. If they can't hear you, they can't dismiss you." These weren't just speaking tips. They were survival strategies from a woman who'd spent her life fighting to be heard. During one session, as Amara practiced a particularly challenging section about the Enigma machine, Eleanor disappeared into her bedroom and returned wearing an old medallion, a simple bronze disc on a faded ribbon. "What's that?" Amara asked. "Something I earned but was never allowed to wear in public," Eleanor said, placing it around Amara's neck. "When you speak, remember who you come from." The weight of the metal against Amara's chest became a talisman, a physical reminder of her purpose. At Thai school, Emily had become Amara's steadfast ally. While other students whispered and giggled about Amara's made-up grandma story, Emily spent her lunch hours in the library, hunting for corroborating evidence. "I found something," she announced one afternoon, sliding into the seat across from Amara and opening her laptop. "There's an article about women codebreakers at Bletchley Park." Amara leaned forward eagerly, but her hope dimmed as she scanned the text. "It only mentions white women." "Keep reading," Emily urged. Near the bottom of the article was a single paragraph. "Recent declassified documents suggest several American women of color may have been recruited for specialized intelligence work at Bletchley, though their contributions remain largely undocumented." "It's not much," Emily admitted, "but it's something. Proof that your grandmother's story is possible." Amara saved the article to her flash drive. It wasn't the definitive evidence she needed, but it was a start, a thread she could follow. That weekend, Eleanor surprised the girls with an unexpected announcement at breakfast. "Get your coats," she said, setting down her teacup with unusual energy. "We're taking a trip." 3 hours later, they stood before the Mosaic Museum of Black History in the neighboring city. It wasn't large, just a converted Victorian house, with a modest sign, but to Amara it represented hope. "My friend Ruth volunteers here," Eleanor explained as they climbed the steps. "She's expecting us. Inside." Displays chronicled the often overlooked contributions of Black Americans throughout history: inventors, scientists, artists, soldiers. In a small room at the back, dedicated to military service, they found what they were looking for: a glass case containing photographs and artifacts from Black servicewomen, and in the corner, a small plaque about the ghost unit of female codebreakers. Amara pressed her fingertips against the glass, reading the brief description beneath a grainy photograph of women in uniform. The names were listed in small type, among them Eleanor Johnson. "It's real," she whispered, turning to her grandmother with wide eyes. "It's here, in a museum." Eleanor nodded, her expression complex, pride mingled with old pain. "Ruth made sure of that. She's been fighting for recognition longer than you've been alive." An elderly Black woman appeared in the doorway, leaning on a cane but standing tall. "Eleanor Johnson," she said, her voice warm with recognition. "Still causing trouble, I see." "Ruth," Eleanor replied with a smile, "still preserving the truth." The women embraced like sisters long separated, while Amara and Emily watched in awe, living history before their eyes. "These must be the girls you told me about," Ruth said, turning to them. "The ones who want to tell our story." Amara nodded, suddenly shy in the presence of this woman who shared her grandmother's secret past. "Well then," Ruth said, reaching into her pocket and producing a small key. "Let me show you something that's not on display." She led them to a storage room filled with archived materials, boxes of documents, photographs, oral histories recorded on tapes and CDs. From a locked cabinet, she removed a folder marked Classified, 1945. "These were declassified just last year," Ruth explained, carefully spreading the contents on a table. "Personnel records, commendations, mission reports with the sensitive details still redacted." Amara and Emily leaned forward, eyes widening as they absorbed the treasure trove before them. Here was the validation they needed: official government, documents acknowledging the work of Eleanor, Ruth, and their colleagues. "May I take pictures?" Amara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For my presentation?" Ruth nodded. "That's why I'm showing you. It's time people knew." Armed with this new evidence, Amara returned to school on Monday with renewed determination. She stayed after class to show Mrs. Kent the photographs of the museum display and the declassified documents. The teacher's reaction was unexpected. "This material is inappropriate for school," Mrs. Kent declared, her voice cold. "It's too political." "Political?" Amara repeated, confused. "It's history." "History is political," Mrs. Kent replied. "And I won't have you using my classroom to push an agenda." Before Amara could protest further, Mrs. Kent turned to her computer and pulled up the class presentation schedule. "I've reviewed your slides and removed them from the server. They contained inappropriate political material." "You deleted my project?" Amara gasped, her stutter returning with the shock. But I've been working on it for weeks." "You're welcome. To start over with an appropriate topic," Mrs. Kent said dismissively. "Perhaps the Navajo code talkers? At least their contribution is well documented." Stunned, Amara gathered her things and fled the classroom, tears blurring her vision. She nearly collided with the principal, Mr. Davis, in the hallway. "Whoa there," he said, steadying her. "Everything all right, young lady?" Before she could stop herself, Amara blurted out the whole story. Eleanor's secret work, the museum evidence, Mrs. Kent's deletion of her project. Mr. Davis listened with a neutral expression. That revealed nothing of his thoughts. When she finished, he sighed deeply. "That's quite a situation, Amara. Why don't you come to my office tomorrow with your grandmother? We'll sort this out." The principal's office was intimidating even under normal circumstances, all dark wood and serious portraits of former administrators. Eleanor sat ramrod straight in the visitor's chair, her cane resting against her knee, while Amara perched nervously beside her. Mr. Davis steepled his fingers, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Johnson, while I respect your military service, I find myself in a difficult position. Mrs. Kent is one of our most experienced teachers, and she has the right to determine appropriate classroom content." Does appropriate mean truthful, Mr. Davis? Eleanor asked quietly. Or convenient? The principal shifted in his seat. We try to avoid controversial topics that might offend some families. And black women helping win a war is offensive? Eleanor's voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed with decades of contained anger. That's not what Mr. Davis began. My granddaughter found my story worthy of telling, Eleanor continued. She's done the research, verified the facts. What more do you require? Mr. Davis cleared his throat. As a compromise, I'll allow Amara to give her presentation, provided it doesn't offend anyone. History often offends those who'd rather forget it, Eleanor replied, rising from her chair with dignity. But my granddaughter will present the truth, respectfully and accurately. Nothing more, nothing less. As they left the office, Amara whispered, What does that mean? How can I not offend people? Eleanor squeezed her hand. You don't have to be loud, baby. You just have to be true. The victory felt hollow when Amara discovered what awaited her the next day. Her locker had been plastered with crude drawings of a girl with an exaggerated stutter, speech bubbles filled with jumbled letters. And worse, her backup flash drive was missing. It was Jake, Emily said with certainty when Amara told her. I saw him hanging around your locker before first period. The confirmation came at lunch, when students began passing around their phones, laughing at something on their screens. Amara didn't need to look to know what it was. She could hear her own voice, recorded during one of her practice sessions, played back with mocking commentary. Such a stupid story, Jake's voice narrated over the recording of Amara practicing her presentation. My grandma was a secret agent. Yeah, right. The video had been posted to the school's unofficial social media group. Within hours, it had spread to every student in their grade. Amara fled to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall as the tears came. All the progress, all the confidence she'd built over the past weeks, it felt shattered. How could she stand in front of the class now, knowing they'd all seen the video? How could she face Jake's smirking face, Mrs. Kent's cold dismissal? She reached for her phone, ready to text her mother to pick her up, to beg to stay home tomorrow and every day after. But her fingers hovered over the screen as Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to be loud. You just have to be true. That night, Amara sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed, the weight of tomorrow's presentation pressing down on her. I can't do it, Grandma, she whispered. Not after the video. Everyone will laugh. Eleanor took Amara's, hands in hers, the young, smooth fingers entwined with old, weathered ones. Let me tell you something I've never told anyone, not even your mother. She reached for an old leather-bound journal from her nightstand drawer. This is the whole story, the parts I couldn't tell you before. As midnight approached, Eleanor revealed the final pieces of her past, how she and her unit had intercepted and decoded a Nazi transmission detailing plans to bomb a civilian shelter in London. How they'd worked through the night, breaking the complex new cipher. How their discovery had saved thousands of lives, but the credit had gone to their white male supervisors. We were written out of the story, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the pain behind her words. Our records buried, our recognition denied, but we knew the truth. Amara looked up from the journal, tears streaming down her face. That's why this matters so much. It's not about medals or glory, Eleanor replied. It's about truth, about being seen. She closed the journal and placed it in Amara's hands. Now you know everything. The question is, what will you do with it? Amara sat silent for a long moment, then straightened her shoulders. Then let's make them listen. She texted Emily, who arrived 30 minutes later with her laptop. Together, they worked through the night, rebuilding the presentation from scratch. No slides were left on the school server to be deleted. No flash drive to be stolen. Everything was backed up to Emily's cloud account, accessible from any computer. As dawn broke, they finished the final touches. A presentation that no one, not even Mrs. Kent, could deny. The morning of the presentations arrived cold and gray, matching Amara's churning stomach. She'd barely slept, running through her speech in her mind until the words blurred together. Eleanor's medal hung heavy around her neck, hidden beneath her sweater. "You'll do fine," her mother assured her at breakfast, though the worry in her eyes betrayed her own doubts. "Just remember to breathe." "And remember who you are," Eleanor added, squeezing Amara's hand. "You come from strong stock." The school hallways seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lights harsher. Students whispered as Amara passed, some snickering behind their hands, others watching with curious eyes. The video had done its damage. She was more of a spectacle than ever. Emily met her at her locker, laptop clutched to her chest. "Everything's ready," she said with forced cheerfulness. "I double-checked all the links this morning." Mrs. Kent's classroom was buzzing with nervous energy when they arrived. Presentation day always heightened anxiety, but today the tension was thicker, more personal. Everyone knew about the conflict between Amara and Mrs. Kent. Everyone had seen Jake's video. The air crackled with anticipation of drama. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Kent greeted them with her usual polished smile. "Today we begin our presentations on the unsung heroes of World War II. I'm sure you've all prepared thoroughly." Her gaze lingered on Amara with the barest hint of a challenge. "We'll go in alphabetical order by last name. That means Sarah Adams will start, followed by Tyler Bennett." Amara sat rigidly through the first few presentations, formulaic reports about generals and soldiers, culled from textbooks and Wikipedia. When Tyler finished his lackluster speech about Navajo code talkers, Mrs. Kent consulted her list. Next would be Zach Harris, but he's absent today. So, Amara Johnson. The room fell silent as Amara made her way to the front, clutching her note cards in trembling hands. Emily gave her a thumbs up from her seat, while Jake leaned back with a smirk, clearly anticipating entertainment. Amara placed her notes on the podium and looked up at her classmates. 25 faces stared back, some bored, some curious, some openly hostile. Behind them, Mrs. Kent watched with narrowed eyes, pen poised over her grading rubric. "Tea today," Amara began, her voice barely audible. "I want to tell you about someone history tried to forget." A titter ran through the room. Jake mimicked her, Stutter with an exaggerated expression, drawing stifled laughs from his friends. Amara's chest tightened. She couldn't do this. She couldn't. Her fingers found Eleanor's medal beneath her sweater. She closed her eyes, remembering the photograph of her grandmother standing tall among her unit. Remembering the journal entries, describing nights spent breaking impossible codes while bombs fell outside. She took a deep breath. 4 counts in, 2 counts hold, 6 counts out. "In 1943, she continued, her voice steadier, a group of Black American women were secretly recruited for a special mission. They were mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers, chosen for their exceptional minds in a time when their country barely acknowledged their humanity." The room grew quieter as Emily connected her laptop to the projector. On the screen appeared the photograph from the museum. 6 Black women in military uniforms standing before Bletchley Park. My grandmother, Eleanor Johnson, was one of these women. They were codebreakers, assigned to Bletchley Park in England, the central site for Allied code-breaking during World War II. As Amara continued, something unexpected happened. Her stutter, though still present, began to recede. Not completely, certain. Words still caught in her throat. But she found a rhythm, a flow that carried her forward. She wasn't speaking to impress Mrs. Kent or silence Jake. She was speaking for Eleanor, for Ruth, for history itself. These women worked in secret, forbidden from telling anyone about their role. Their contributions were classified, their achievements attributed to others. But make no mistake, Amara's voice grew stronger. They helped win the war. She walked them through Eleanor's journey, from recruitment to training to the tense nights deciphering enemy communications. She showed the declassified documents, the museum exhibits, the commendation letter. With each piece of evidence, the mood in the classroom shifted. Even Jake's smirk faded as the weight of history settled over the room. In October of 1944, Amara said, "My grandmother's unit intercepted and decoded a message revealing Nazi plans to bomb a civilian shelter in London. Their work saved thousands of lives, but when the records were written, Their names were omitted, their faces erased. Mrs. Kent shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Amara, I think that's enough. I'm not finished, Amara replied, with a quiet firmness that surprised even herself. I still have 2 minutes according to the guidelines. A murmur rippled through the class. No one challenged Mrs. Kent like that. No one. These women, Amara continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, returned home to a country that still made them sit at the back of the bus. They couldn't talk about what they'd done, couldn't put it on resumes, couldn't claim their place in history. She flipped to her final note card. We call them unsung heroes because we chose not to hear their songs, but that doesn't mean they were silent. It means we weren't listening. As Amara prepared to conclude, the classroom door opened quietly. A few students glanced over, then did double takes. Whispers erupted as Eleanor Johnson entered, leaning on her cane but radiating quiet dignity. She wore a simple dress, but pinned to her chest were medals that had been hidden in drawers for decades. The room fell absolutely silent. Mrs. Kent half rose from her chair. Excuse me, this is a closed classroom? Please continue, Amara. The principal's voice came from behind Eleanor. Mr. Davis had followed her in and now stood by the door, arms crossed. I'd like to hear the conclusion of this presentation. Amara's eyes locked with her grandmother's. In that moment, something passed between them. Strength, courage, a shared defiance that transcended generations. My grandmother and her fellow codebreakers weren't just fighting Nazis, Amara said, her voice clear and strong. They were fighting for a future where their grandchildren could speak their names with pride, where history would finally make room for their truth. She walked to Eleanor's side and took her hand. This is Eleanor Johnson. She helped save thousands of lives. She broke enemy codes by day while bombs fell by night. She was a warrior without a weapon, a hero without a headline. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She reached into her purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its official seal still visible. We were codebreakers, Eleanor said, her voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. We were warriors. And we were invisible. The silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then Emily began to clap. Slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Others joined in, tentatively, then with conviction. Soon most of the class was on their feet, applauding not just Amara's presentation but the living history before them. Jake remained seated, his expression unreadable. Next to him, Brooke wiped a tear from her cheek, clearly moved despite herself. Only, Mrs. Kent seemed unmoved, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment or perhaps both. She gathered her papers with sharp, jerky movements. Thank you, Amara, she said, her voice tight. That was unconventional. We'll move on to the next presenter. Actually, Mr. Davis interjected, I think we should take a moment to ask Mrs. Johnson some questions. It's not every day we have the opportunity to speak with someone who made history. Mrs. Kent's smile vanished completely. I need to step out for a moment, she announced. Class, please behave until I return. She brushed past Mr. Davis and disappeared into the hallway, the click of her heels fading rapidly. In her absence, the classroom transformed. Students crowded around Eleanor, asking questions that Amara would have never imagined them caring about just days ago. Did you ever see Hitler's actual messages? Were you scared of being caught by spies? How did you keep the secret for so long? Eleanor answered each question with patience and grace, occasionally glancing at Amara with pride shining in her eyes. This wasn't just validation of her past, it was witnessing her granddaughter find her voice in the present. As the impromptu Q&A continued, a boy Amara barely knew raised his hand. I'm sorry about the video, he said quietly. Jake made it, but we all watched it. That wasn't right. Others nodded in agreement, shame evident on several faces. Near the back of the group, Jake himself stood awkwardly, hands shoved in his pockets. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual swagger. Your grandmother is pretty cool, he admitted grudgingly. I didn't know black women did stuff like that back then. There's a lot we don't know, Amara replied, meeting his eyes directly. For the first time, her stutter was still there, hovering at the edges of her words, but it no longer defined her. Maybe we should start listening better. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students lingered, reluctant to leave the presence of living history. Mr. Davis finally shooed them toward their next classes, promising that Mrs. Johnson would visit again soon for a proper assembly. In the suddenly empty classroom, Amara exhaled deeply, releasing weeks of tension. She had done it. She had stood her ground, told the truth, and made them listen. "You did good, child," Eleanor said softly, squeezing her hand. "You did real good." "We did it together," Amara replied. As they gathered their things to leave, Amara noticed a sheet of paper on Mrs. Kent's desk, her grading rubric for the presentations. Next to Amara's name was a single question mark. No grade, no comments, just the symbol of a system confronted with a truth it wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Amara left it there, untouched. Some validation couldn't be measured in letters or numbers. Some victories transcended grades. In the hallway, Emily waited with a grin that threatened to split her face. "That was amazing. You should have seen Mrs. Kent's face when your grandmother walked in. I thought she was going to faint." "Where did she go?" Amara asked, suddenly realizing the teacher hadn't returned. "I heard she went straight to the principal's office," Emily whispered. "But Mr. Davis was with us, so—" Mr. Davis approached them, his expression a careful neutral. "Mrs. Johnson, Amara, thank you for an educational morning. I think we all learned something important today." "And what might that be, Mr. Davis?" Eleanor asked, fixing him with a look that had probably intimidated far more imposing men. He cleared his throat. "That history isn't always what we think it is, and that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we haven't heard yet." They walked toward the exit. Amara's world felt fundamentally changed. Students who had never spoken to her before nodded in greeting. Teachers watched her pass with new respect in their eyes. Even Jake, when she passed him in the hallway, gave her a grudging nod of acknowledgement. But the most profound change was inside herself. The stutter that had defined her for so long now seemed like just one aspect of who she was. Not a limitation, but simply a part of her voice, a voice that she now knew could shake a room. Outside, her mother waited in the car, curiosity written across her face. "How did it go?" she asked as they approached. Amara and Eleanor exchanged a look, years of shared history and newly forged connection passing between them. "Let's just say," Eleanor replied with a smile, "they finally heard us." By lunchtime, the video had spread throughout Westlake Middle School. Not Jake's cruel mockery of Amara's stutter, but a new one. Amara standing tall beside her grandmother, their voices united across generations. Someone had recorded Eleanor's entrance and her powerful words. "We were codebreakers, we were warriors, and we were invisible." Amara sat in the cafeteria, surrounded by classmates for the first time. Emily beamed beside her, fielding questions. When Amara's voice grew tired, "Is it true they weren't allowed to tell anyone?" asked Zoe, a quiet girl who usually sat with the art crowd. Amara nodded. "They signed the Official Secrets Act. Breaking it meant prison." "That's messed up," said Derek, a boy Amara had barely spoken to before today. "They help win the war and get treated like that." As the conversation flowed around her, Amara caught sight of Jake across the cafeteria. He sat with his usual group, but something had shifted. The confident swagger was diminished, his laughter less certain. Occasionally, his eyes drifted toward Amara's table with an expression she couldn't quite read. After school, Amara found Mr. Peterson waiting by the front gate. The Vietnam veteran who lived down the street had never acknowledged her before, but today he stood straight as a flagpole, offering a crisp salute as she approached. "Your grandmother," he said simply. "I'd like to thank her for her service." Before Amara could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "OMG, your presentation is going viral. Local news just called my mom asking for an interview. The Johnson." Household phone began ringing that evening and hardly stopped. First came the call from Channel 7 News, requesting an interview with the heroic Codebreaker and her brave granddaughter. Then the Black History Museum, asking if Eleanor would Consider donating some of her memorabilia for a special exhibit. A popular history blog called, followed by the city newspaper. This is getting out of hand, Denise Johnson said, hanging up after the fifth call. Amara's mother looked both proud and concerned as she watched Eleanor calmly sipping her tea, seemingly unfazed by the sudden attention. Mom, maybe we should hold off on these interviews until things settle down. Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care. I've been settling down for 70 years, Denise. I'm 84 years old. How much longer should I wait to be heard? The following morning, Amara was called to the principal's office before first period. Her stomach clenched as she made her way through the quiet hallways, remembering all too well their last meeting. To her surprise, Eleanor was already there, seated across from Mr. Davis, who looked like he hadn't slept well. Amara, thank you for joining us, he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside her grandmother. We need to discuss the situation that's developing. What situation? Amara asked, though she had her suspicions. Mr. Davis slid a tablet across the desk. On the screen was a local news website with the headline, Hidden Hero, Black WWII Codebreaker. Finally recognized after middle school presentation. This has generated significant attention, Mr. Davis said, choosing his words carefully. While the school supports historical education, we need to be mindful of disruptions. Is history a disruption, Mr. Davis? Eleanor asked, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. The principal sighed. Mrs. Kent has filed a formal complaint. She claims you disrupted her class without permission, and that Amara's presentation created a divisive atmosphere. Divisive? Amara couldn't help herself. It's the truth. The truth is complicated, Amara, Mr. Davis replied, and the school board is very traditional. All I'm asking is that you both tread carefully. We don't want this turning into some kind of political statement. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane. Young man, I didn't choose to be political. Politics chose me the day I was born black in America. Now, if you'll excuse us, my granddaughter has classes to attend. As they left the office, Amara whispered, Are we in trouble? Eleanor smiled slightly. Trouble is just opportunity wearing work clothes. Throughout the day, Amara noticed the ripples spreading. Students from other grades stopped her in the hallway to ask about Eleanor. 2 teachers quietly told her they'd thought her presentation was courageous. The school librarian had set up a display about hidden figures in history, prominently featuring books about black contributions to the war effort. Not everyone was supportive. She overheard a group of 8th grade boys snickering about making up fake grandma stories for attention. And Mrs. Kent's classroom felt like enemy territory, the teacher calling on everyone but Amara, her pointed silence more punishing than any reprimand. After school, Amara found Emily waiting at her locker, practically vibrating with excitement. You won't believe this, Emily said, her voice hushed with awe. My dad knows someone at the university's history department, and they want to interview your grandmother for their oral history archive. And, she paused dramatically, my dad says he wants to help. He's been researching all day looking for official records to back up your grandmother's story. Amara felt a surge of gratitude. Emily's father had initially seemed skeptical about Eleanor's claims, but now he was becoming an ally. As they walked home, a car slowed beside them. Amara tensed until she recognized Mrs. Peterson, the Vietnam veteran's wife. Amara, dear, she called through the window. There's a letter for your grandmother, hand-delivered. She passed over an envelope with careful handwriting. At home, Eleanor opened the letter while Amara watched anxiously. It's from William Thompson, Eleanor said, her voice soft with surprise. He served on a destroyer in the Atlantic. Says he always suspected someone was feeding them intelligence about U-boat locations. She looked up, her eyes bright. He says thank you. That evening, as they sat watching the local news cover Eleanor's story, the phone rang again. Eleanor answered, then went very still. Ruth, she whispered, is it really you? Amara watched her grandmother's expression transform. Shock, then joy, then something deeper, like hunger. She spoke in rushed phrases, asking questions, falling silent to listen, occasionally wiping at her eyes. When she finally hung up, Eleanor turned to Amara with wonder. Ruth Morgan. She was in my unit at Bletchley. I thought she'd passed years ago, but she saw the news story. Her voice trembled. She's coming here, Amara. And she has documents. Papers I thought were destroyed after the war. The next day brought another shock. Jake was called to the principal's office during second period. By lunch, everyone knew why. His parents had seen the viral video of their son mocking Amara's stutter, and they were not pleased. Jake approached Amara's table hesitantly, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. Emily stiffened protectively, but Amara gave her a reassuring nod. My parents want me to apologize, Jake said, the words coming out stiff and rehearsed. For the video and other stuff. It wasn't much of an apology, but Amara recognized what it cost him to make it publicly. Okay, she said simply. Jake stood awkwardly for a moment longer. Your grandmother really did all that code-breaking stuff? Amara nodded. That's pretty cool, he admitted, then walked away, shoulders slightly less hunched. Emily's support had grown beyond friendship into organized action. By the end of the week, she had created an online petition calling for Eleanor to be officially honored during the school's upcoming Memorial Day assembly. Students were signing it, then sharing it with parents and relatives. Veterans who'd seen the news were adding their names. The count had already passed 200. We're making history, Emily told Amara breathlessly as they updated the petition page during lunch. Your grandmother deserves this. Not everyone agreed. A group of parents, led by Frank Wilson, father of an 8th grader and known for his conservative views, had started calling school board members. They claimed the school was pushing revisionist history and liberal propaganda by elevating Eleanor's story. It's not in the textbooks for a reason, Mr. Wilson was overheard saying in the school parking lot. If we start changing history to make everyone feel good, where does it end? The division grew sharper when an anonymous email arrived in the principal's inbox. Somehow, Amara never discovered who sent it. Someone had uncovered Mrs. Kent's personnel file from her previous school. The sealed record contained 3 separate complaints of discriminatory behavior toward minority students. Mr. Davis called an emergency faculty meeting that afternoon. Through the grapevine, Amara learned that Mrs. Kent had stormed out halfway through, her face flushed with anger or shame. The tension built throughout the week, culminating in the announcement of a special school board meeting. The agenda: deciding whether Eleanor Johnson should be honored at the upcoming Memorial Day assembly or banned from campus for disruptive behavior. The stakes had never been higher. The Sunday before the school board meeting, Amara sat cross-legged on Eleanor's bed as her grandmother opened a worn leather album she'd never shown anyone before. Inside were not just photographs and documents, but memories Eleanor had locked away for decades. This was our quarters at Bletchley, Eleanor said, pointing to a sparse dormitory room with 6 narrow beds. We were segregated even there. White. Women had nicer accommodations closer to the main building. She turned the page to reveal a group of women, black and white, working together at rows of desks covered with papers. But when the work got hard and the pressure was on, they needed all hands. Bombing raids didn't care about color. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she reached a photograph of a young white officer in British uniform. Handsome, with kind eyes and a serious expression. Thomas Welling, she said softly. Royal Navy Intelligence. Who was he? Amara asked, noting the care with which her grandmother touched the photo. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Someone who saw me when others looked through me. He was assigned to coordinate between our unit and naval operations. Her voice grew distant. We worked closely for months. Too closely, perhaps. Amara's eyes widened with understanding. You loved him. It was wartime, Eleanor said simply. Everything feels more urgent when tomorrow isn't guaranteed. What happened to him? Eleanor closed the album. He was reassigned suddenly near the war's end. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Just gone. I was told later he'd been sent on a classified mission. I never heard from him again. She looked at Amara with a sadness that seemed to reach across decades. "I never told your mother. How could I explain that her father might have been a white British officer who disappeared without a trace?" Amara sat in stunned silence, absorbing this revelation about her family history. Before she could ask more questions, the doorbell rang. Downstairs, a delivery man handed over a package with British postage stamps. Eleanor opened it with trembling hands to reveal a stack of official-looking documents, recently declassified. British intelligence records that Emily had somehow tracked down through an online history forum. Among the papers was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Eleanor in neat, masculine handwriting. "It's from Thomas," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, dated September 1945. She opened it slowly, as if afraid it might disintegrate at her touch. As she read, tears began rolling down her cheeks. "He was deployed on a covert operation," she said finally. "When he returned, he tried to find me. But I'd already been sent home. The letter was returned as undeliverable." She looked up at Amara. "He looked for me, child. He didn't just disappear." Before Amara could comfort her, the front door opened, and her mother's voice called out, "Mom! Amara! I'm home!" Denise Johnson wasn't supposed to return from her business trip until Tuesday, but here she was, striding into the living room with determination written across her features. At 42, she looked like an Eleanor from another time, strong, proud, but with a guardedness her mother lacked. "I saw the news," Denise said without preamble. "Why didn't you call me?" "You were working," Eleanor replied calmly. "And we handled it." Denise turned to Amara. "Are you okay? This sounds like it got out of hand." Amara nodded. "I'm okay, Mom. Better than okay." Denise's expression softened slightly. "I'm proud of you, baby. Standing up like that couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Amara admitted, "but Grandma helped." Denise's eyes moved to the open letter in Eleanor's hands. "What's that?" For a moment, Amara thought Eleanor might hide it away, maintaining the secret she'd kept for decades. Instead, she held it out. "Something I should have shown you long ago. It's about your father." The tension that had always existed between mother and daughter, a subtle distance Amara had never understood, suddenly made sense. Denise had grown up without knowing her father's identity, and Eleanor had buried the truth so deeply that even mentioning the war became painful. As Denise read the letter, her composed exterior cracked. "All this time," she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" "At first because I couldn't," Eleanor replied. "Later, because I didn't know how." The two women looked at each other across years of unspoken history. Then slowly, Denise moved to sit beside her mother, their shoulders touching, in a rare moment of physical connection. "I wish I'd known him," Denise said finally. "He would have loved you," Eleanor replied. "He was a good man." The following day brought another unexpected arrival. Ruth Morgan, now in her 80s like Eleanor but still sharp-eyed and formidable, arrived in a taxi from the airport. The reunion of the two former codebreakers was emotional, decades of separation dissolving in tears and laughter and half-finished sentences that only they understood. "I brought everything," Ruth said, patting her large handbag. Everything they didn't manage to classify or destroy. Together, Eleanor and Ruth spread their collected evidence across the dining room table. Photographs, commendations, technical notes on decryption methods, and personal journals, kept despite regulations forbidding them. "This will help at the board meeting," Amara said, carefully organizing the materials. Ruth's expression darkened. "I heard about that. Still fighting the same battles after all these years." "Some wars never really end," Eleanor replied. That evening, they received another unwelcome surprise. Mrs. Kent had spoken at a hastily organized PTA meeting, framing Eleanor's recognition as a political agenda being forced on our children. "We must protect our children from unnecessary guilt about the past," she had reportedly said, her words carefully chosen to avoid overt racism while stoking parental fears. Eleanor received the news with a grim lack of surprise. "I've heard that song before," she said. "Different lyrics, same tune." As Ruth and Eleanor sat together reviewing their documents, Ruth began sharing stories she'd never told, about women in their unit who had died over the years, taking their secrets to the grave. Women who had suffered strokes, heart attacks, cancer, all without public recognition of their service. Dorothy had the funeral of a school cafeteria worker, Ruth said bitterly. Not a war hero. Pearlie died alone in a nursing home where no one knew she'd helped sink a Nazi battleship by decoding its position. Eleanor's composure finally broke. Decades of pent-up grief and anger poured out as she wept in Ruth's arms. We should have fought harder, she sobbed. Should have made them hear us. Amara watched from the doorway, witnessing her grandmother's strength and vulnerability intertwined. This wasn't just about a school presentation anymore. This was about justice delayed for too long. Emily's petition had exploded overnight, reaching 3,000 signatures and growing. Local veterans had signed, then shared it with their networks. Former students, community leaders, and even a state senator had added their names. News outlets were now regularly calling for updates, and the school board couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. But with recognition came backlash. The morning before the board meeting, Amara opened her locker to find a note slipped through the "Prince, go back to silence." She showed it to Eleanor, who increased security around the house without comment. She'd seen this before, the pushback that always came when comfortable narratives were challenged. That night, Amara practiced her speech for the board meeting in front of her family, Ruth and Emily. She had grown more confident over the past weeks, her stutter less pronounced though still present. "I'm nervous," she admitted when she finished. "Good," Eleanor said. "Nervous means you care. But remember, this time, they'll listen." Later, as the house grew quiet, Eleanor found Amara sitting alone on the back porch, staring at the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked, easing down beside her. Amara shook her head. "What if we lose tomorrow? What if the board sides with Mrs. Kent?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Then we keep fighting, just like we did during the war, one message at a time, one code at a time." She took Amara's hand in hers. "I never wanted to be seen, you know. I just didn't want us erased. But now I know. Your voice is stronger than I ever let mine be, because of you," Amara said. Eleanor smiled gently. "No, child, despite me. I kept my silence too long. You're braver than I ever was." They sat together under the vast sky, grandmother and granddaughter, connected by blood and history, and something stronger, the courage to speak truth whatever the cost. The school board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6:15 the parking lot was already overflowing. Cars lined the surrounding streets and a steady stream of people made their way toward the middle school auditorium. Amara watched from the back seat of her mother's car, anxiety tightening her chest. "There are so many people," she whispered. Eleanor, sitting beside her in a dress she usually reserved for church, patted her hand. "Truth draws a crowd, child." As they approached the entrance, they spotted two distinct groups gathering. On one side, supporters held handmade signs, "Honor our hidden heroes," and "Black history is American history." On the other, a smaller but vocal group carried messages, like "Keep politics out of schools and stick to the textbooks." Inside, the auditorium hummed with tension. The school board members, 5 men and 2 women, all white except for one black woman, sat at a long table on the stage, shuffling papers and whispering among themselves. Mr. Davis hovered nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd swelled beyond the room's normal capacity. Emily waved frantically from the 3rd row, where she'd saved seats. Her father, Dr. Taylor, sat beside her, his academic's demeanor contrasting with Emily's, barely contained excitement. "The petition hit 3,500 signatures an hour ago," Emily whispered, as Amara slid in beside her. "And look." She pointed toward the back where camera crews from 2 local news stations were setting up. "They're covering it live." Amara scanned the packed room. Teachers sat in clusters, some offering encouraging smiles, others carefully neutral. Students had come with their parents, including several from Amara's class. Even Jake was there, slouched, between his well-dressed parents, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Kent sat in the front row, ramrod straight, a folder of papers clutched in her manicured hands. Beside her was Frank Wilson, whose son had never been in Amara's class, but who had appointed himself the leader of the opposition. At precisely 7:00, the board president, a silver-haired man named Richard Blackwell, tapped his microphone. "This special meeting of the Westlake School Board will come to order. We're here to address the matter of," he consulted his notes, "appropriate recognition of historical figures within our curriculum and school events." The careful wording wasn't lost on Amara. They were already framing this as a curriculum issue, not a matter of truth or justice. "We'll begin with statements from the parties directly involved," Mr. Blackwell continued. "Mrs. Kent, as the teacher who raised concerns, you may speak first." Mrs. Kent approached the podium with the confidence of someone used to authority. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same measured tones she used in class, but with an underlying edge Amara had never heard before. "Board members, fellow educators, parents, I come before you not to deny history, but to protect the educational integrity of our school. What began as a student presentation has spiraled into a situation that threatens to politicize our classrooms." She looked directly at Amara for the first time that evening. While I appreciate Amara's enthusiasm for her family history, her presentation contained unverifiable claims and created a divisive atmosphere. When her grandmother entered my classroom without permission, disrupting a planned lesson, it crossed a line. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Mrs. Kent continued. "More concerning is what followed. My teaching methods questioned, my professional record invaded, my character attacked, all because I asked for academic verification." She placed her hands on the podium, leaning forward. "If we allow family stories to replace verified historical sources, where does it end? If we permit outside adults to interrupt classes to make political statements, how do we maintain order? My job, my duty, is to ensure students learn established facts, not to promote individual agendas." As Mrs. Kent returned to her seat, Frank Wilson nodded vigorously, leading a smattering of applause from his supporters. "Thank you, Mrs. Kent," Mr. Blackwell said. "Now we'll hear from—" "Excuse me." Dr. Taylor stood unexpectedly, raising his hand. "I'd like to speak next, if I may." The board president frowned at the interruption but nodded. "Please state your name in relation to this matter." "Dr. James Taylor. I'm a professor of American history at State University and the father of Emily Taylor, a student in Mrs. Kent's class." The room quieted instantly. Even Mrs. Kent looked surprised. Dr. Taylor approached the podium with a leather briefcase from which he withdrew several folders. "Board members, I originally came tonight simply to support my daughter's friend. But as a historian, I cannot remain silent when history itself is being mischaracterized." He opened the first folder. "What we're discussing isn't a matter of family stories versus established facts. It's about how we determine what constitutes historical truth and who gets to decide which voices are heard." With methodical precision, Dr. Taylor presented document after document, military records, declassified intelligence files, academic papers, and museum archives, all confirming the existence and contributions of black female codebreakers at Bletchley Park. These women's stories were absent from our textbooks, not because they didn't exist, but because their work was classified, their contributions minimized, and their experiences excluded from the dominant historical narrative. He looked directly at Mrs. Kent. "Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when systematic forces have worked to erase certain histories." The silence in the room was absolute as Dr. Taylor placed a final document on the projector. "This is a recently declassified commendation citing the work of Eleanor Johnson and her unit in decoding German naval communications that saved Allied ships from attack. This isn't family lore. It's documented fact that deserves recognition." As Dr. Taylor returned to his seat, Ruth Morgan rose slowly from her place beside Eleanor. "I'd like to speak next," she said, her voice soft but carrying. The board president, looking increasingly out of his depth, nodded. "Please come forward." Ruth made her way to the podium with deliberate steps. Though her body showed her age, her voice was clear and unwavering. My name is Ruth Morgan. I served alongside Eleanor Johnson at Bletchley Park from 1943 to 1945. We were part of a specialized unit of black women mathematicians and linguists assigned to naval intelligence. She looked out at the sea of faces. For decades, we couldn't speak about what we did, couldn't put it on job applications, couldn't even tell our families. That silence was forced upon us, first by war security, then by a country that wasn't ready to acknowledge our contributions. Ruth paused, her gaze finding Mrs. Kent. Young lady, you questioned whether our service was verifiable. Tell me, how does one verify what was deliberately hidden? How do we prove our existence when our names were omitted from official histories? She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small, tarnished medal. This was given to me by a British commander after our unit decoded a message that saved a hospital ship. He told me to keep it hidden, that officially it never happened. I've carried it for 70 years, waiting for someone to believe it was real. The room was utterly still as Ruth continued. We didn't die in combat, but we died quietly, our contributions buried, our achievements attributed to others. Not today, though. Today, we are seen. As Ruth returned to her seat, the applause began, scattered at first, then swelling until it filled the auditorium. When the room finally quieted, Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat. We'll now hear from the student, Amara Johnson. Amara's legs felt leaden as she stood. Her prepared speech seemed inadequate after what she'd just witnessed. She made her way to the podium, feeling every eye upon her, hearing her pulse thundering in her ears. My name is Amara Johnson, she began, her stutter immediately threatening to overtake her. She paused, breathed deeply, and started again. My name is Amara Johnson, and my grandmother was a codebreaker during World War II. She looked out at the audience, at Emily's encouraging smile, at her mother's proud gaze, at Mrs. Kent's rigid posture, at Jake's unexpected attentiveness. When I started researching her story, I just wanted to pass a class assignment. I didn't expect to discover a missing piece of history. I didn't expect to find my voice. As she continued, something remarkable happened. Her stutter, though still present, became part of her rhythm rather than an obstacle. She spoke about discovery and silence, about recognition and erasure, about the cost of forgetting and the power of remembering. My stutter, she said, touching her throat briefly, is the sound of courage surviving history. Every time I speak despite it, I honor those who weren't allowed to speak at all. She gestured toward her grandmother. Eleanor Johnson and women. Like her, broke enemy codes while living under codes of silence and separation at home. They served a country that didn't serve them equally. They saved lives that would never know their names. Amara looked directly at the school board. When we honor only the parts of history that make us comfortable, we dishonor truth itself. My grandmother deserves recognition, not because she's my grandmother, but because she helped save the world and was written out of the story. As Amara returned to her seat, the applause was thunderous. Even some who had come to support Mrs. Kent found themselves clapping, moved by the girl's sincere passion. The board president appeared about to call for a vote when the back doors of the auditorium swung open. A distinguished-looking man in his 90s entered, supported by a younger relative. His chest bore military decorations, and he moved with the deliberate dignity of one who had commanded respect throughout his life. That's Admiral Parker, someone whispered loudly. He served in both World War II and Korea. The Admiral made his way slowly down the center aisle as conversations hushed around him. When he reached the front, he nodded respectfully to Eleanor and Ruth before turning to address the board. Richard, he said to the board president, apparently an old acquaintance. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but when I heard what this meeting was about, I couldn't stay home. Mr. Blackwell looked both honored and flustered. Of course, Admiral. The floor is yours. The Admiral's voice was weathered but commanding. In the spring of 1944, I was a young lieutenant on the USS Lexington. We received intelligence about German U-boats in our path, intelligence so precise, so timely, that it could only have come from decoded enemy transmissions. He turned to face Eleanor and Ruth. I never knew who provided that intelligence. Never knew whose work saved our ship and the 3,000 men aboard. Not until today." He straightened to his full height and saluted them. "On behalf of those men, many, now gone, thank you for your service." The room erupted in emotion, applause, tears, exclamations. Mrs. Kent remained seated, her expression unreadable as the narrative she had fought so hard to control crumbled around her. When order was finally restored, the board president called for a vote. It was quick and decisive, 6-1 in favor of honoring Eleanor Johnson at the upcoming Memorial Day Assembly and installing a permanent plaque in the school's Hall of Honor. Mrs. Kent gathered her papers and walked out before the vote was even formally recorded, her heels clicking sharply on the auditorium floor. She never returned to teach at Westlake Middle School. Outside, as cameras flashed and reporters sought interviews, Eleanor finally allowed herself to weep, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of recognition after so many years of silence. "After all this time," she whispered to Amara, "I can finally be proud." As they made their way through the crowd, Amara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Jake standing there, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes focused somewhere, over her shoulder. "That was pretty cool," he muttered. "What you did?" Amara studied him, remembering months of mockery, the cruel video, the laughter at her expense. But she also saw something new. A boy struggling to acknowledge he'd been wrong. "I was wrong. About your grandma," he continued awkwardly. "And about you." He shifted his weight, finally meeting her eyes. "Can I help? With the assembly thing? I'm good with computers and stuff." Amara considered for a moment, then nodded once. Yes. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet. But it was a beginning. As they walked toward the parking lot, Eleanor's phone rang, an unusual occurrence at this hour. She answered, listened for a moment, then handed it to Amara with a stunned expression. "It's the Pentagon," she whispered. Memorial Day dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the recognition. Long overdue. Westlake Middle School's annual assembly had always been a modest affair. A few patriotic songs, a reading of names from the local Veterans Memorial, punch and cookies afterward. This year was different. The gymnasium had been transformed. Red, white and blue bunting draped from the walls. A professional sound system replaced the usual crackling microphone. The bleachers were filled not just with students, but with community members, veterans, and media representatives. Backstage, Amara helped adjust Eleanor's corsage, a purple heart flower surrounded by baby's breath. In the week since the board meeting, Eleanor had become something of a local celebrity. The Pentagon had invited her to Washington for a formal recognition ceremony later in the summer. A documentary filmmaker had begun interviewing her and Ruth for a project about forgotten heroes, and most surprisingly, 3 other women from their Bletchley Park unit had been located, all still living, all with stories to tell. "Are you nervous, Grandma?" Amara asked, noting Eleanor's trembling hands. "Not nervous," Eleanor replied. "Just wishing some who aren't here could see this day." She was thinking of Thomas, Amara knew. They had discovered he had passed away in 1989, never knowing what became of the young woman he'd loved during wartime. But his family had been located, and his son, a man in his 70s who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor's eyes and smile, would be meeting them in Washington. The principal, Mr. Davis, approached with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, for the first time. "Mrs. Johnson, we're ready for you now." Eleanor nodded, and Amara helped her to the wheelchair they'd insisted on for the long walk to the stage. The audience rose as one when they appeared, applause thundering through the gymnasium. At the podium, Mr. Davis welcomed everyone to a special Memorial Day assembly, where we not only remember those who fell in service, but also recognize those whose contributions went too long unacknowledged. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair on the stage, dignified in a blue dress with her military pins displayed proudly. Beside her, Ruth Morgan and the 3 other surviving members of their unit, Vivian, Dorothy, and Margaret, formed a line of quiet strength, their combined ages totaling over 400 years of living history. Amara stepped to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "Today we honor Eleanor Johnson," she began, the stutter barely noticeable now. "Codebreaker, war hero, grandmother." She read the official citation, recently released from classified archives, for exceptional service in naval intelligence operations, resulting in the protection of Allied shipping and the successful interdiction of enemy naval activities in the Atlantic Theater, 1943-1945. The citation continued, detailing specific operations where Eleanor's unit had broken critical codes, saved ships, and contributed to battle strategies, all while facing segregation and prejudice both in England and upon their return home. As Amara finished reading, Mr. Davis unveiled a bronze plaque, "The Invisible Codebreakers, honoring Eleanor Johnson, Ruth Morgan, Vivian Cooper, Dorothy Wilson, Margaret Lawson, and all the African-American women whose wartime service remained classified until 2024. The plaque would hang permanently in the school's main hallway, alongside memorials to local soldiers who had given their lives in various conflicts. Eleanor's eyes shone with unshed tears as she surveyed the audience. Some of the older veterans saluted her. Students who had once ignored or mocked Amara now watched with rapt attention. Emily beamed from the front row, sitting between her parents, her father nodding in professional approval at the historical accuracy of the ceremony. Even Jake's parents appeared moved, though Jake himself seemed most interested in the video equipment. He was operating, documenting the event for the school's archives with unexpected dedication. After the ceremony, the school courtyard filled with people eager to meet the former codebreakers. Local reporters circled, seeking interviews. History teachers from other schools asked about classroom visits. Veterans shared their own stories of service. Through it all, Eleanor held court with grace, answering questions with the same sharp intelligence that had once broken enemy codes. When asked how it felt to finally be recognized, she smiled. "Recognition is nice," she said, "but truth is essential." The media attention snowballed in the days that followed. A local news segment went viral nationally. Historians began reaching out. Then came the call from Oprah's production company, followed by documentary filmmakers seeking rights to their story. 2 weeks after the assembly, Eleanor and Amara flew to Washington, D.C., accompanied by Ruth and the other surviving codebreakers. At the Pentagon, in a ceremony attended by military leaders and politicians, they received formal recognition for their wartime service. "You cracked more than codes," a general told them during the ceremony. "You cracked silence itself." Later, that summer on a bright August morning, Mr. Peterson helped Amara hang a new display in the school's history wing, Hidden Figures of Westlake. It featured photographs and stories of local residents whose contributions to history had gone unrecognized, beginning with Eleanor and her unit, but expanding to include others whose stories were now emerging from the shadows. Mrs. Kent never returned to Westlake Middle School. A brief letter of resignation cited irreconcilable differences in educational philosophy and blamed political correctness for undermining traditional historical education. Few mourned her departure. In her place came Ms. Lawson, a young, Black history teacher whose approach to the curriculum included multiple perspectives and encouraged students to research beyond their textbooks. Her first assignment for the new school year: find a hidden hero in your own family or community. Emily, inspired by her role in Eleanor's recognition, founded a school club called Historical Justice Project. Their mission: to uncover and document overlooked contributions to local and national history, particularly from marginalized communities. Jake, surprisingly, became one of the club's most dedicated members. His expertise with video equipment proved valuable as they recorded oral histories from elderly residents. The boy who had once mocked difference now helped preserve it for posterity. As for Amara, her stutter remained, but it no longer defined her. In the fall of 8th grade, she entered her essay, "The Code They Couldn't Break," in a national young historians competition. It traced not just Eleanor's wartime service, but the systematic forces that had kept such stories from being told, and the courage required to break that silence. When she won first place, she traveled to New York to accept the award, standing before an audience of historians and educators, with quiet confidence. History isn't just what happened, she told them, her voice strong despite the occasional stutter. It's also what we choose to remember, what we choose to honor, and what we choose to teach. On Eleanor's 85th birthday, 3 generations of Johnson women gathered in the living room that had once served as Amara's speech training ground. Denise, who had grown closer to her mother since learning the truth about her father, presented Eleanor with a framed family tree, now complete, with Thomas Welling's branch and connections to his British descendants, who had welcomed them with open arms. "Thank you," Denise said simply, embracing her mother, "for finally telling me the truth." Eleanor's eyes misted as she traced the connected lines of heritage. "Truth takes time," she replied, "but it always finds its way home." Years later, when Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92, hundreds attended her funeral. Military honors were rendered. Flags flew at half-staff throughout the town. Her obituary appeared not just in local papers, but in national publications, recounting her service, her breaking of barriers, and her late-in-life recognition. Amara, now a poised young woman in college, stood at the podium to deliver the eulogy. Her voice was clear and strong, the stutter still present but worn now like a badge of honor rather than a burden. "My grandmother taught me that silence isn't peace," she said, looking out at the gathered mourners. "And now, I will never be silent again." As she spoke, she fingered the tarnished medallion around her neck, Eleanor's secret commendation, now passed to her. Not just a piece of metal, but a tangible reminder of courage, of persistence, of truth that refuses to remain buried. In the WWII, back of the church, Jake, now a journalism student focused on historical documentation, recorded her words. Emily, pre-law with a focus on civil rights, wiped tears from behind her glasses. Together, they represented the ripple effect of one girl's courage and one woman's long-delayed recognition. The legacy of Eleanor Johnson lived on, not just in museums and history books where her story now appeared, but in the voices of those who had learned from her that history belongs to those brave enough to reclaim it, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that every voice, no matter how it sounds, deserves to be heard. What voice within you remains unheard, waiting to change the world? If Eleanor and Amara's journey touched your heart, like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and share to help others find the courage to break their own silences.